Okay, so now you guys will recall that we talked about um, the 1890, the frontier was closed. What does that mean? Remember we talked about that? 1890, frontier was closed.
There's nowhere else to go.
We had nowhere else to go. And what was that going to do to American life? The fact that the frontier wasn't there anymore, Turner, what? Where did the American character come from?
Well, the frontier basically
Exactly.
As they're
is the idea,
expanding.
is the expansion and like kind of like the freedom you get from the frontier, I
Right. So if
suppose.
there is no more frontier, what then?
You move on to
Well,
Hawaii and the
right.
Philippines and
If you're in danger,
Cuba.
if you don't continue to expand, so it's going to be really in the 1890s that the United States starts to really look overseas for in terms of its uh, imperial outreach. Okay, now that's not to say that before that the United States wasn't an imperial power, because the United States essentially conquered the North American continent for the purpose of accessing its resources. Okay, so the United States, let's say, for example, that we're Britain. Okay, and we have cotton textiles. Our economy is based on cotton textiles, but you can't grow cotton in England, right? And so you have to go somewhere else to get it. And they got it first in the American colonies, and then they got it in Egypt and in India, right? But what they did was they would have to go overseas to get their resources. And the United States didn't have to do that because all the resources we needed were right here on our continent, right? And so Americans really don't look overseas for uh, for uh, im- uh, for imperial expansion because they don't need to, right? But then when we get to the 1890s and what we're going to see is this is kind of the height of the imperialist era, all right, and uh, the imperialist era essentially um, what it's going to require is going to be that Americans are going to, or any country that doesn't become an imperialist country is going to fall behind, right? Remember we talked, I think at one point about the challenge of the 20th of the 19th century was either modernize or be colonized, right? Okay, so now the way the United States starts to acquire an overseas empire is during the Spanish American War. Okay, you can read about the Spanish American War in your book, right? And you will read about that. Uh, but the the upshot of it is this: that the United States had economic interests in Cuba, and it was sugar. Okay, the Cuban economy was based on export of sugar, and most of those sugar exports ended up going to the United States. But Cuba was still under the control of the Spanish Empire. All right, and what happened was that there was an independence movement in Cuba that the Spanish were um, crushing. Okay, and this is going to play into the American press because at the same time in the United States there's a competition, a fierce competition between two newspaper empires, the Hearsts and the Pulitzers. Okay, and so that competition was based on who can sell the most newspapers. And one of the ways that seemed like a good way to sell newspapers was to report sensational stories, right? You guys are probably familiar with, uh, like if you're sitting there watching TV on, say you're on network TV, which I haven't watched in years, but say you are, right? You're sitting on network TV and the commercial comes on, and then right before you go back to your program, there's a little blurb and it says, aliens land in El Cajon, film at 11, right? right? And so you say, oh, there's aliens in El Cajon. I got to watch this news, right? And then you watch the news, and all the way at the end, there'll be like a 30-second segment about some little kids in El Cajon that dressed up like aliens or something like that, right? But the point was that they got you to watch so you could see all their ads, right? And that's the same thing that we see with these newspapers. It's called yellow journalism, right? And the idea behind yellow journalism is you make these stories to be so appealing that everybody wants to buy, and you see it all the time around you now. I mean, there's so much sensationalized news. And why is it sensationalized? Well, because it sells products. Okay. Same thing happened then. Okay. But the problem was that that at that time, and probably still today to a certain extent, right? They often crossed the line. Essentially, what they would do is make news, right? So one of the places where we could see a lot of sensational news was in Cuba, right? Because Cuba would jail, revolutionaries and conduct trials and be oppressive, and Americans could read about that, and they would say, oh, those Cubans, those poor Cubans are just like us, and our problems with the British, but their problems were with Spain, and it was very sensational, right? But for example, there was one photographer who was sent down to Cuba to take pictures of all the atrocities that were being committed, and when he got there, he cabled back to New York that he couldn't find any atrocities, and the editor said, well, you just send us the pictures and we'll make up the atrocities, right? you follow what I'm saying? So that's the way Americans are getting their information about what's happening in Cuba. And then the battleship Maine explodes in Havana Harbor, okay? Now, there's a good reason to believe that the Spanish didn't have anything to do with blowing up the battleship Maine, okay? But it was sensationalized in America, so much so that they would actually publish newspapers with pictures, not pictures, but drawings of Spanish sailors attaching bombs to the Maine, right? Okay, so Americans are like, we got to go get those Spanish, right? And so America ends up declaring war against Spain. And the problem for the Spanish was that their empire was teetering, right? They had nothing left really, except for Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands. And they had their fleet was in such bad shape that when they tried to get underway, they sank because the rust was so heavy on the bottom of their ships, right? So the war was really almost not a war, right? What Theodore Roosevelt, the American president, is going to call a splendid little war, right? It lasted like 6 weeks, right? And then all of a sudden, the Americans have this empire. They've acquired what was left of the Spanish Empire, or they're in control of it, right? So there's Puerto Rico, and then there's Cuba, and there's the Philippine Islands, all right? And so now just stepping back a little bit here, when the United States declares war against Spain, one of the things that the United States does is to declare that they're not in the war to annex Cuba, right? So they promised in this war that they would not annex Cuba. It's called the Teller Amendment, right? The idea here is that we're not doing it to gain territory. We're doing it actually to save these poor people from your oppression, essentially, right? So what will happen then is that the United States can't annex Cuba, but there's a question about Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands. And so what will happen is then that there will be a debate that happens in the United States over whether or not the United States should acquire an overseas empire. And guess what it's called? It's called the imperialist anti-imperialist debate.